Hi, I'm Congressman Steve Israel, author of Big Guns, and you're watching Author's Voice.
Welcome to Author's Voice, which is connecting authors to the world. This is our debut of a new show called Novel Conversations. And I'm Daniel Weinberg, your host, and we're embedded at our broadcast studio at the Abraham Lincoln Bookshop in Chicago. If you're watching this on Facebook Live, or on our website for that matter, go to the comments button if you want to ask a question while we are live. Don't forget to give your name and where you're from so we can give a shout out and say hello. And you can order a signed book, first edition, right now. And if you're on YouTube later on, you can, after the broadcast, you can also order a signed copy of first editions while they last, because usually these go out fairly quickly. So, I'm so happy to be able to introduce our guest today, and Steve Israel, a former U.S. Congressman.
Don't hold that against me.
I shan't, but we could use you now right now.
Thank you.
Representing the 3rd Congressional District on Long Island from 2001 to just last year, 2017. He served in the House Democratic leadership as Assistant Democratic Whip and was chair of the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee. He's now a political commentator, I know you've been on CNN at least, and a writer in residence at Long Island University. He's the author of The Global War on Morris, and now his latest and second novel is called Big Guns. It's done by Simon & Schuster, 310 pages, and it's $26. And, you know, I want to ask you before we go on, because I love this design, Big Guns, of course, and that's what it's about, but here is the chapter heading, and each chapter heading has a gun like this. But I want to ask you who came up with that, but also what does this mean right here on the top, which is a shadow of the gun. And I'm wondering how that was designed.
That
Who
is
came up
very
with that?
perceptive of you. I have to say, I've been on a long national book tour. You're the first person to ask those questions.
Someone has to.
Somebody's got to, Daniel. And I'll tell you, I learned a lot about the development of a book, not from the perspective of the creativity of the author, but from the perspective of the marketing experts at the publishing house. And in this case, the folks at Simon & Schuster had submitted to me a variety of designs. And, you know, they design these things so that they will appeal to buyers. And in a crowded book market, so you've got to have a color that pops.
Oh, the
Obviously,
color
pops,
pops. In back of us
yeah.
is
I got to tell you,
lights.
I got off the plane. I'm from New York. I flew in from New York, got off the plane at O'Hare, and was walking past a bookstore at O'Hare and saw this brilliant orange, and it was my book. So I could see it from a long distance
cool.
away. And then the designers also, the artists at Simon & Schuster also told me that they wanted to embed the design in each chapter. I pretty much failed any attempt I've ever made at art other than writing, and so I deferred to them.
Yeah, very
but
good.
they have an expertise.
Someone came up with an interesting idea,
Yeah.
and I like that very much. I don't know what that shadow is on the top. I have to ask Simon & Schuster. We'll see if we can find out.
Honestly, I didn't even notice it until you brought it up. Now I have to call Simon & Schuster and
we'll
ask
find
them.
out together.
Yeah.
We'll let all of you know later on. I just have to do this because you're at the Abraham Lincoln Bookshop, and we have many historical artifacts that come in, and I'm always worried about forgeries of a Lincoln document or a Washington letter. So my own grandfather, he fled the Ukraine, really fleeing the Tsarist army is one story. The other story, maybe he was a horse thief. I kind of like that one myself. But there's a new movie out. Melissa McCarthy is in it.
Yeah.
And it's about someone called, a real person, Lee Israel. And the name of the movie is Can You Never Forgive Me? It's based on a true story of Lee Israel,
Really?
who was a struggling author, turned to forgery to pay bills, and during the 1970s and 80s, forged all sorts of letters from Katharine Hepburn, Tallulah Bankhead, Estee Lauder, Dorothy Kilgallen, and sold them to dealers like myself. But that's when she could no longer get published. So my question to you is there a connection to Lee Israel. And did you really write this book and not Lee?
I wrote the book. I have never met Lee Israel. I don't know Lee Israel. Whatever misdeeds he committed, I did even worse. I was a member of the United States Congress for 16 years. So,
Good point.
no, I wrote the book in its entirety.
All right, that's
Yeah.
good. I knew that, but I
That's
had to get that
That's the
in.
bad branch of the Israel family. We have nothing to do with them. We don't even talk to them at Thanksgiving.
Now, the book takes place in a town,
Yeah.
fictional, that I looked it up, couldn't find it, but then I did find someone named Asa Bogue
Yeah.
on the web, a white male born in Tennessee in 1940,
Really?
living in Monroe Township, Mississippi, Arkansas. No connections there then. That's not,
you
you didn't use his name to
No, I'll
name
tell
a
you.
town.
First of all, you are a master of detail, I must say. The book takes place in several areas. Obviously, Washington, D.C. It's a satire, a parody of Washington, D.C. and the gun lobby. And so it takes place in Washington. It takes place in Chicago. Chicago is a very important location for the book. And it takes place in a little village that is totally fictitious, but is based on several small villages on the east end of Long Island near the Hamptons. And I was
Which you
trying
would
to
know.
find, I live on Long Island, and I was trying to find a name that would be befitting, and came up with Assabog. There's a little place called Aquabog on Long Island. And so readers of the book can understand why I replaced Aquabog with Assabog.
Yes, all right.
We'll leave it to their imagination.
Well, let me ask you about your writing.
Mm-hmm.
You've been compared to Carl Hiaasen, which is not a bad comparison,
No, I'll
thank
take it.
you. So what authors do you read, and which were the most
Yeah.
influential for you?
Because I am a political satirist, I like to stay with that genre. And so I've been very heavily influenced by Christopher Buckley. This book, Big Guns, has been compared to Thank You for Smoking, which Buckley did. Christopher has been very kind to me, gave me a blurb, and I've met with him from time to time. Carl Hiaasen is an influence. There's a wonderful author of spy novels named Nelson DeMille, who happens to be a Long Islander. He wrote this book, Gold Coast, that I think is the quintessential definition of life on Long Island. So Buckley, Hiaasen, Nelson DeMille were all important influences in my own writing.
So you're going to stick with political writing in the future as well, then?
You know, maybe. And here's why there's a struggle right now in literary circles. My agent and my publisher argued to me that political satire right now is on hiatus, that there's a low market ceiling on political satire. And the reason for that is that people believe, no matter what side of the aisle they may be on, that every day is more satire. That the reality of what is happening in Washington is so satiric that they're not going to buy a book on the subject. Now, I disagree, and we're testing the premise with this book because it is a look at the gun lobby in Congress in a small town in the city of Chicago.
A 0 degree from the NRA.
I had a 0 rating from the NRA, yes. Which it didn't even disappoint my mother, who used to yell at me when I brought in like a math test with a 98, and she'd say, "What about the other 2 points?"
right,
A 0
right.
from the NRA,
What
she
about the
was
other
good
tie?
with. But so there is this real swirling debate as to whether satire is on hold for the time being, and we're testing the premise. I hope not. I believe so fundamentally that satire has always been an accessible way of bringing readers into serious issues. So if you think about Joseph Heller, I've also been influenced by him, Catch-22, which is a satiric look at World War II, or Mark Twain, who used satire to point to the evils of slavery and racism. I use satire to tell the story of why Congress doesn't act when there are mass shootings around the country.
But that was maybe the first question I had about 3 pages into the book, and I knew I wasn't the first to be asking about this, but the bizarre behavior of some of your characters are wonderful, except are they any more bizarre than what's happening in reality, when reality trumps whatever character bizarreness you can do?
No pun intended.
It was. And so what is a novelist to do?
Yeah.
How do you
Yeah.
relate then when you know that every day might take out one of your characters as being more bizarre?
It's a good question. Look, in my view, every satire has to have kernels of truth. Otherwise, it's just a Three Stooges routine with pie in the face. every single one of my characters in Big Guns is a collection of real people that I served with in Congress, local officials, mayors. They're all the aggregate of different characters that I have known. And it was very important to me to reflect those realities in these characters, not make them too absurd. But there is this difficulty that satirists have when their absurdities, built on a kernel of truth, are overwhelmed by the truth, which is an absurdity. And we'll just have to see if we can kind of muddle through that.
That's exactly why I write many, many questions, because I'm always afraid the author is going to answer 10 of them in one fell swoop. And you did answer the next one, which was...
Well, I'm in Congress. I'll give you a different answer.
Yes, of course. Okay, that sounds great. I'll take it. So, for your bizarre ideas the character has of arming every citizen, which is a central part of this. I'm not giving anything away. That's been out already. And I was going to ask about, does every bizarre, most bizarre political ideas have a grain of truth, or maybe truthiness at least, to it? When I thought about this with the NRA and arming every citizen, I immediately went to the Cold War and the USA versus USSR, both nuclearized to the hilt, and it was mutual destruction that we knew stopped either of us from doing anything. Same thing with perhaps if every citizen had a gun, would we understand? Well, we better not, because that person does too.
Well, right now the talk is to arm teachers in schools. This pretense in the book, this plot that Congress considers a bill mandating that every American must own and carry a gun with exemptions for minors under the age of 7, I'm sorry to tell you, is based on truth. Again, every satire has to have a kernel of truth. After the shooting in Sandy Hook in Connecticut, an elementary school, many people thought Congress was going to finally do something. And Congress did nothing. Well, we had moments of silence. We tweeted our thoughts and prayers. But there was no serious action taken. At the state and local level, there was action. And so states and localities, villages and cities began passing common sense measures, not to take people's guns away, just to make them safe, except for the small city of Nelson, Georgia. And this is what inspired my book. The city leaders of Nelson, Georgia were so repulsed when they heard that other governments were trying to impose regulations on gun safety that they decided to go the other way. They passed a regulation in the city of Nelson, Georgia, after the Sandy Hook massacre that required all residents of Nelson to possess a firearm.
How did that go over?
And it passed. It passed.
Still there?
It was struck down several months, I believe, later. But when this was done, and I read about it, I thought, you ever hear the parody, The Onion? Have you ever heard of it? I thought The Onion infiltrated the New York Times when I read this story in the New York Times. And that's when I had the kernel of truth upon which to build my satire. Congress does the same thing. They federalize it. The gun lobby, so sick and tired of being on defense whenever there is a mass shooting, they decide they're going to go on offense. And they get a lobbyist to get a congressman to introduce this bill. Everybody thinks it's an absurd idea in the book. The president, the Speaker of the House, the Senate Majority Leader, they all think it's absurd. And yet, it moves through the Congress.
Let's not give away what happens
I'm not
in the
going
end.
to say a word.
Do you have your endings already when you start to write? What's your writing process?
Yeah.
Do you know where you're going, or do you just let the story take you along?
I'm always fascinated by the rituals that individual writers have. I read one of the best books I've ever read is a book called Daily Rituals: How Artists Work. Phenomenal book. And writers have different techniques. For me, I wrote my first novel, The Global War on Morris, on my iPhone. Because I was in Congress, I was in these meetings, I was able to do this in real time. I could hear somebody say something absurd and write it down. And so my ritual is to write all the time. When I see something, observe something, just take out my iPhone now and just start writing. I do my first drafts all on an iPhone. I've developed this thumb muscle memory And then I'll put it into a Word document, edit off that. In terms of structure, I never have an ending. I didn't have an ending on my first book or the second book. I go where the story takes me. And I think that's the best and most authentic way to write.
So what came first with you when you were younger?
Yeah.
And that is writing or a political ambition to do something. Which came first, or how did it develop, and how did your writing develop in that regard?
I had three dreams when I was growing up on Long Island, New York. One was to one day be in Congress. The second was to one day be a novelist. The third was to one day play outfield for the New York Mets. And since the baseball thing didn't cut, although now I think I could play outfield for the New York Mets, given how they're doing lately.
After yesterday.
That's right. And so I'm one of those fortunate individuals who had not just one dream come true, but two. I went to Congress, served 16 years. While I was in Congress, I decided that writing was my therapy. It was my relief and my release. And after 16 years, I realized in this climate of gridlock and screaming and shouting, I wouldn't write a law that would pass. So instead, I should just write books that make a point.
Did you start writing in grade school, high school, college? Were you writing then?
I was taken by Ray Bradbury, the science fiction writer, and I just consumed anything that Ray Bradbury wrote. One of the biggest thrills of my life was to get a copy of Fahrenheit 451 signed to me by Ray Bradbury because he was on a crusade to save the public libraries in America, and I became involved in that issue. And he wrote me a note and a description in the book. So I began writing at a young age, influenced by Ray Bradbury, and continued to write all the way through.
You know, a recurring theme in this book are all the associations, legislative acts, caucuses, committees, acronyms that continue through the book. For instance, G Group, get the government out of our pockets. ROB, Republicans opposed to borrowing. MSNBC, Marxist Socialist National Broadcasting System. Did you sit one morning in your kitchen with a pot of coffee and a joint and just do this for 10 hours and come up with them?
Not the joint part.
I knew you'd say that.
Very, very careful. So I may be out of Congress, but I still have to be very guarded.
How about the coffee, though?
No, you know, one of the things I learned when I went to Congress in 2000 is not only is it reflect the diversity of the American people, but there's a caucus or a working group or a committee or an organization, association for almost any cause you can imagine. You know, I am the former chairman of the Civil War Caucus in the United States Congress, which, because of differences that some of my Southern and Northern colleagues had, we renamed the American Battlefield Heritage Caucus. So there, and I was always fascinated by all these caucuses and task forces, and I kind of made fun of it. I poked fun of it in the book by creating all these acronyms, but that was fun to do, actually.
The antiquarian side of our shop has been for 85 years specializing in the Civil War.
Yeah.
So how do you feel about what's happening today with monuments? I have an idea myself that I don't want to see them destroyed. I'd almost like to put them all in one outdoor park where the story can be told and they still be preserved as historical artifacts. What's your take?
You know, I'm a big believer in putting myself in other people's shoes and also reflecting on how would this affect me. So I will tell you, initially I was concerned that we kind of lose our history if we're going to, you know, take everything down, that, you know, Confederate monuments are a reminder of the evil that occurred and the people who perpetuated it, and why take them down. But I have to say, when I thought about it, what would I do if I saw a memorial to a National Socialist? What would I do if I saw a monument to a Nazi? And so I can understand that sensitivity. At the same time, I think we have to be careful to teach the lessons of good and evil and use many of these symbols as learning tools.
Yeah, I agree with you on that. I felt the exact same way. That's what kind of turned me toward this. What if I was an African American walking around and seeing John Breckinridge, for heaven's sakes, standing up there? But I don't want to see them put away or melted down either. Another thing that you have in your book is a nice turn of phrase for some nice edgy lines for bumper stickers.
Yeah.
I think we have something to show here. one of the great edgy lines that I liked was the woman who's the main character in here, thinking keeping a congressman engaged but not engorged was what she was about. I love that. But can you define your style of writing? You've always written as a congressman, you say. Can you define yourself, how you come up with things like that, the bumper stickers?
It's another great question. In one of my early drafts of my first novel, The Global War on Morris, my agent read it and she said, this is terrific. She said, but I actually think you need to slow it down a little bit. She said, it can't be rim shot after rim shot. And she said, be more selective. So I like to write from a place of wit, but you also have to be careful not to make it a nightclub act. I enjoy the process of coming up with these one-liners, but they really have to be paced and measured and fit into the context of the book, which I think we've achieved in Big Guns.
I think you have. That worked for me, all of those. Besides Charlton Heston, who was right off the bat, you knew who that was, what character was. So you say they're based on more amorphous mayors you've known and legislators you've known. Is there anyone else that a political junkie might, or inside the Beltway, might see in there?
Absolutely. I could tell you, but I'd have to kill you.
Yeah, exactly. I understand
So
that.
here's the thing I enjoyed the most. My colleagues in
So far, the
Congress,
NRA, you just got a 5% boost.
my colleagues used to witness me, just kind of pecking at my, at the iPhone, and it got to the point where they knew that I was writing these books, and they would come up to me. Several would come up to me and say, "Wait a minute, are you writing about me?" And I would look at them and say, "No," and they would go, "Oh." They'd be disappointed, because in Washington, members of Congress read books from right to left. We start with the index. We see if our names are there. If our names are there, then the book is worth reading. So we start from the front. And so many of my colleagues wondered. That's right, right. I will say that every single character in this book is based on either one, two, or three people. They're collectives. They're aggregates. And they have already recognized themselves. I've gotten a couple of emails saying, wait a minute, I remember telling you that. That's quoted. I didn't sign a release. So a good political junkie who has nothing better to do with their time than watch C-SPAN 3, which I would never recommend, can go through this book and figure out who's who and who is the basis character from my characters.
The NRA was founded in 1871, the year of the Chicago fire, by the way. I don't know if there's any connection to this, but nonetheless. But things get out of hand in Chicago and all of that. How has the NRA, from the founders, changed till today? Has there been a fundamental change?
There's been a fundamental change. In fact, the change has been accelerated over the past, I'd say, 15 or 20 years. I mean, it was 20 years ago, the NRA was supportive of common sense measures to reduce gun violence. After the Las Vegas shooting, the NRA came out in support of doing something with respect to these bump stocks and then kind of just stopped pursuing that position. The NRA, I think, first of all, let's be clear, it's not a monolith. About 80% of NRA members support no-fly, no-buy. If you're too dangerous to get on an airplane, you shouldn't be able to buy a military-style assault weapon. The majority of NRA members support stronger background checks. And yet, the organization itself just reflexively opposes almost anything. And I think the reason for that is they actually feel challenged from organizations to the right of them. They feel that if they don't come out against everything, they're going to lose market share to other organizations. And that explains, I think, why we're in the mess we're in.
I have a question that's come in from the internet, from our website. Bob, thank you, and Poughkeepsie, appreciate it. Kind of briefly, do you think that satire can make real change in our culture, if not our politics?
Bob, what a great question.
Thanks,
yes,
Bob.
I do. Bob, Mark Twain used satire to poke at people's consciences. Joseph Heller used satire. If you watch the show MASH on television, which was based on a movie, that injected satire into really the debate over Vietnam and a post-Vietnam era. And so I think that many of my colleagues and lawmakers and politicians have lost credibility. I think people are just kind of factoring out all of that. And that's why satire is more important than ever. It brings people in, it raises their consciences in an accessible, sometimes humorous way, sharpens their understanding of an issue, and then enables them to act on that issue.
Thank you for that question, Bob. You skewer most of the time. You're skewering the far right in this book, but then you get to the left as well at the
equal
end.
opportunity offender.
There was one character lamenting there are no pathways to victory in a certain election that's coming up, and you write, that's music to their ears.
That's right.
And so how do you view the spectrum, and how do you view the far left, the far right? Is it a circle? Is it a spectrum? How do you look at it?
Well, it's a polarity. I mean, the far left is getting further left, and the far right is getting further right, and that's what's happening. It's very important to me in the book not to just skewer one side, and I really wanted to balance that. And so the point I was making, based on my own being a political operative in Washington, chairing the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee, I really wanted to use the book to contrast the left and the right. And in the book, the right will do anything, say anything, spend any amount of money, do what has to be done to win the argument. And the left, God bless the left, they go to the local stationery store, they buy their Sharpies, their oak tag, they have nice silk screen t-shirts, they show up in the minivan, and they sing Kumbaya. And I really wanted to create that contrast. And you can't win battles by singing with oak tag and Sharpies.
Well, Bill Maher is certainly asking the Democrats to get out there and act more like the Republicans.
I've always wished that Democrats were more like Republicans tactically, not ideologically, tactically, because I think we'd win many more battles.
What is your interpretation of the Second Amendment? Because there's a full sentence there.
Yes.
Militia being part of it.
Right.
Gun rights being a part of the same sentence. How do you view that?
The reason that we have a judiciary in this country is because amendments were written in a certain context, and amendments can be interpreted, misinterpreted. The fact of the matter is that the Second Amendment is, in my view, necessary. People have the right to bear arms. But the Second Amendment was written at a time where there were no semi-automatic weapons, where you didn't have bump stocks, where you couldn't just walk into a gun store and buy an AR-15. And it was intended to ensure that a militia was well armed. Well, we have a militia. It's called the National Guard and the Reserve. So I think that the Second Amendment has been misunderstood. Having said that, I think people like from my party fall into the trap of making this an argument about the Second Amendment. It is not. We ought to protect the Second Amendment. People have the right to bear arms. But with that right comes responsibility. And that includes making sure that some nut can't bring an assault weapon into a school and slaughter our children.
Good points. Chicago.
Yeah.
We have our problems here with guns and gun safety and murders. And you give an idea of gun tracking, bullet tracking here in Chicago. And you call us a pulsating orb of all that tracking. So based on technology, is there any technology like that proffered where perhaps we can see on an electronic map all the let's say the bullets that are shot by a bad guy in black, and maybe all the bullets by the cops in blue, so we can tell the difference?
I don't know whether the technology is that advanced, but I do know as a member of Congress that I represented a community that had a lot of violence, and we were able to get a technology that was able to transmit to police when a gun was fired, approximately where that gun was fired. And so they were able to respond much more rapidly and much more efficiently. And so I bring that into the city of Chicago, and I amplify that satirically as well.
I want to ask you about the convention. Now, get into reality here a moment. Not that this book doesn't get into that.
Right.
I've felt for some time, and now all of a sudden there was a New York Times editorial that kind of backed my position here, that I like the convention system. I don't especially mind the party deciding whom they want to represent them and to represent their agenda, and also be the bulwark against others who just come out of the blue, and it's just really a personality contest. So what is your thought on that? Should there, it started, of course, back with McGovern and
Yeah,
all of that
yeah.
we wanted to make it democratized as much as possible, but I think it's gone too far, and I would like to have the party have a say.
Look, I think there needs to be some sense of party discipline. At the same time, I don't want to close off all options. It's America. People have the right to run. They have the right to make their case. When I chaired the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee, I had to make some pretty tough decisions where I had a candidate in a kind of a purple district, Republican-leaning district, who was a good fit, and then somebody who might not have been a good fit in a general. And sometimes I had to talk truthfully to them and say, look, we got to win this district if we're going to have checks and balances. Tough conversation to have, but sometimes a necessary conversation.
Well, I'm looking for what our future is here, and I'm not sure I'm finding it.
Well, when you find the future, you let me know, because I'm a
I'll
little worried.
let you know exactly it. There it is. Thank you. My staff helps me
Very
out on
good.
this.
Good staff is essential.
So, coming up on
Yeah.
Author's Voice, connecting authors to the world, later today, just very soon, in a little over an hour, A House Divided with Richard Quest discussing his book, I Held Lincoln. Bjorn Skaptason will host that. That's today at 5:30 Central. So come right back and watch it. It's an interesting book about a man who was a soldier who helped carry Lincoln's body across the street to Peterson House. Next week, on Tuesday, May 22nd at 11 a.m. Central, Lit with Love. Amy Reichert with her new novel, The Optimist's Guide to Letting Go. And the same day at 1 p.m., this is May 22nd, next Tuesday, but at 1 p.m. Central, will be Solved with mystery author Michael Corrida, How It Happened. This is his second appearance on our broadcast, and we're happy to get Michael back. If you have any questions that you want to ask, you can always do that before the shows as well and during, and I hope you will do that. If you'd like to order a signed book, go to authorsvoice.net, and we'll get you a first edition signed of this and the other books that are upcoming. If you're watching this on YouTube after the broadcast, you can still order signed books. Look at the link under the title. Well, we're very happy. This was brief,
you.
and I had much more to ask, but we have to keep ourselves going here.
Of course.
Appreciate your coming here.
My pleasure.
We appreciate Simon & Schuster for sending you here, and I hope that you will return. This is a fascinating book. I think you will enjoy it, and I want to say thank you to the staff for helping out. We couldn't do this without the staff here at the Abraham Lincoln Bookshop for Author's Voice. So come back again. We'll look forward to seeing you.